Welcome, everybody. It's Monday, October 27th, 2014, the beginning of another week of programming. And today I'm going to be talking to you by myself without a guest, and I'm going to cover the God question. This comes up quite a bit among libertarians. In fact, it's hard to imagine a libertarian conference without an after-hours debate on the subject of God. So I wanted to raise this issue because there have been a number of people over the years, very good supporters of mine, who have said things along the lines of, that Woods is a swell guy and everything, but my goodness, is he terrible when it comes to God. He believes in God. So, everybody's got his own blind spot to deal with, and, we'll look the other way for this on this one deviation from Woods. So I get this kind of a lot. Well, maybe not a lot, but I get it enough that I felt like I should devote an episode to it. Now, I'm not saying by any means that everyone who is agnostic or atheist has a kind of superiority complex like this. Certainly, I know many such people who are quite respectful and with whom I've had very good friendships over the years. But we all know, whether atheist or theist, that there are people out there who have this kind of attitude that, some people seem to have faith, and I'm just a scientist. So there's just no way I can be sucked into this nonsense. And these people might just as easily be worshiping the flying spaghetti monster. It's equally plausible. So I just thought, I think I've just got to take this on. So that's what this episode is about. I'm going to show you that I am not an idiot for believing in God. There's actually a reasonable positioned argument to be made here. And again, I'm in no way, I don't want this to distract attention from what I'm about to do, I'm in no way saying that everybody who disagrees with me is either an idiot or disrespectful or rude or superior. I'm in no way saying that. But there is a sliver, there's a group out there that does have this sort of attitude. But let me start off by saying, if you have advanced this idea that people who believe in God, really, they ought to just go ahead and believe in the flying spaghetti monster. There's just as much evidence for it. Don't do that. Okay, don't say that, because you're basically making a fool of yourself. And I'm not trying to insult you. I'm looking out for you. I'm looking out for you. Other people who share your views probably think you've really stuck it to those people by laughing at them using the flying spaghetti monster example. But by the end of this episode, you'll see how preposterous that is. You'll see that anybody who is familiar with the work of Thomas Aquinas, for example, will listen to this and say, the flying spaghetti monster argument, and say, another teenager who reads nothing and thinks he knows everything. Now, the problem that's faced here is that the chances that you have as a college undergraduate of encountering Thomistic metaphysics and Thomistic philosophy at any length is about the chance you have of encountering Austrian economics. And therefore, you wind up with people coming out of school thinking they know all about a particular area when they've never even been exposed to a really key school of thought. It's like Paul Krugman, who thinks the Austrians are unscientific, and I can't believe I have to debate with these people, and yet the guy can't even be bothered to state correctly what the Austrians believe about business cycles. Well, likewise, I have encountered so many people who are going to lecture me about how irrational I am to believe in God, who have absolutely no idea what the argument from the Unmoved Mover is. They have no idea, never heard of it, or if they have heard of it, they think it has to do with one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, and then one moving thing makes another thing move. They think it's that. They have no idea what Thomas and Aristotle mean by motion, none at all, and yet they're nevertheless going to launch into tirades against people, even though they frankly are not entitled to an opinion until they have acquainted themselves with the sources. So what I'm going to do today relies heavily on the work of my friend Ed Feser, F-E-S-E-R. Now, Ed and I don't agree on everything. We have areas of important disagreement, but he's a very smart guy, and he's a friend. And I've been a student of his indirectly over the years. So let me share with you one argument for the existence of God. But it takes a while to build up to it, because I need to introduce some terminology. Thomas Aquinas, of course, we're talking about the 13th century figure, roughly 1225 to 1274, And we associate with him something called the Quinque Viae, which is Latin for 5 ways. These are 5 ways of demonstrating the existence of God. And in the Summa Theologica, he gives you a little taste of these 5 ways, but he really develops the argument at much, much greater length in the Summa Contra Gentiles. And incidentally, I have a number of people who follow me who also have liked Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, on Facebook. Well, just one difficulty with Dawkins, apart from the fact that his own colleagues have called him an embarrassment to the new atheism, is that he actually says that Aquinas, even though he may think he's proven the existence of God, even if he hasn't shown us that the God he has proven to exist must be just one, or must be all-powerful, or have all these other attributes. Well, no, Aquinas doesn't really do that in the Summa Theologica. That's true. But he spends hundreds of pages on this subject in the Summa Contra Gentiles. I don't think it's too much to ask that people who are going to make a public argument on a subject of great importance at least be acquainted with the basic facts of the matter. All right, so what I'm going to do is give you kind of a modern adaptation of Aquinas' first way, the unmoved mover. And let's begin by understanding, what does Aquinas mean by motion? And Aquinas is thinking in an Aristotelian sense. He's thinking of motion as moving from, or going from, potentiality to actuality, or in the older terminology, from potency to act. That's what Aquinas means by motion, the reduction of potency to act. Now, we'll probably use the terms potentiality and actuality because they're more familiar to us. But what does he mean by that? Well, think about when you put your cold leftovers from the refrigerator, you put them in the oven, and then you take them out of the oven and they're hot. Well, that dinner had the potential to be hot, and that potential was actualized by the oven. So it moves from a condition of potentiality to actuality. Or think about a person growing. A person grows from being 4 feet tall to 5 feet tall. Well, that person had the potential to be 5 feet tall when 4 feet tall, and then that potentiality was actualized through eating and good nutrition and so on and so forth. Or moving from A to B, moving from place A to place B. Somebody moving from A to B has the potential to be at B, and then actualizes that potential. That potential is actualized. Or think about maybe a part of your bicycle rusting. Well, the bicycle had the potential to rust, and then that potential was actualized through various ways. That's what we mean by potentiality and actuality. Okay, these are things that we see all the time. All the time. We see potency being reduced to act. Potentialities becoming actualities. Now, let's also note here at the outset what Thomas Aquinas is not saying. Here are a couple of arguments Aquinas is not making. He is not saying the universe couldn't have gotten started unless God had set everything in motion a long time ago. He is absolutely not saying that. He is not talking about events far in the distant past. He is not talking about that. So get that out of your head. He's talking about events taking place in the here and now. That's how he's demonstrating the existence of God. Not that there needed to be a God to get the ball rolling. That is not the argument Aquinas is making here in the first way, the unmoved mover. Secondly, he is not saying everything has a cause. I can't believe how many people I run into who think that's the argument for the existence of God, that everything has a cause, and so God must be the cause of everything. They actually think that's what religious believers are saying, that everything has a cause, and so God must be the cause of everything. And then they come back with, well, then what caused God? And then they triumphantly march around the room as if they've won the argument. But no one has ever said that. There is nobody in the tradition of Western theism of any significance whatsoever who has made that argument. And I mean going all the way down to the 20th century to Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. There is nobody who made that argument. Because, of course, that argument does open them to the objection, well, then what caused God? Oh, ho, 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 ho. Right, that's why they're not making that argument. And moreover, a critic could say, well, look, if God doesn't have a cause, well, then couldn't we just as easily say maybe the universe doesn't have a cause? If God didn't need one, maybe the universe didn't need one, and there's your argument in tatters. Well, thankfully for Aquinas, that's not what he was saying to start with, so we don't need to deal with that uninformed objection. Here's the argument Aquinas is making, and it's an astonishing argument. He's saying that the universe could not continue in existence, not come into existence. The universe could not continue in existence right now, and change could not occur right now without God's keeping it in existence and being the source of change right now. All right, let's go into some examples. We've got the ideas of motion, meaning, or change, meaning going from potency to act, potentiality to actuality. Your dinner is potentially hot, now it's actually hot, and so on. Also, another Aristotelian idea, because of course Aquinas is very much a follower, a student, and expounder and developer of Aristotle. Another Aristotelian idea that he's going to employ is that no potential can actualize itself. Your dinner does not heat itself. No matter how much you stare at it, no matter how much you hope that it will become hot, it must be made actual. Its potential for being hot must be actualized by something outside itself. That's another Aristotelian idea. Another Aristotelian idea, we don't have to get into the Aristotelian doctrine of the four causes. I do talk about that in my Western Civ course at tomwoodshomeschool.com. But for now, I'll just say this. The immediate efficient cause of a thing is simultaneous with it. So in other words, imagine your friend's car is stuck and you have to push that car to help him get it out. The immediate cause of the car being pushed is the application of the hands and force of the person. But for Aristotle and for Aquinas, the pushing with your hands and then the car moving out of the rut that it's in, these are the same thing. It's not like two actions are going on here, that my hands are moving forward and the car is moving forward. This is all one thing that's occurring simultaneously. And then just one more concept in order to proceed and make the argument. We need to distinguish between two different kinds of series, an accidentally ordered series and an essentially ordered series. For an accidentally ordered series, the classic case would be a father who begets a son, and then his son begets his own son, and that son begets his own son, etc. The reason this is an accidentally ordered series is that the son can beget a son even if his father is dead. His father's continuing presence and continuing action is not necessary for this series to continue. The father's son has his own independent power to beget a son, and it does not rely on the continued existence of the father. So the father could drop dead, but the son can still have children. That's what we call an accidentally ordered series. Now, on the other hand, let's consider the classic Thomistic example of a stick and a stone. And let's imagine that you're walking down the street, you see a stick, you pick it up, and then you happen to see a stone, and you're bored as you're walking, so you use that stick to push the stone along as you walk. So what's happening here is that your hand is pushing the stick, which pushes the stone. Now, whenever the last part of a series like this, the movement of the stone, exists, then the earlier parts, the motion of the hand and the stick, exist. The stone moves only because the hand and the twig move it. The hand, of course, is what really moves the stone, right? The stick is just the instrument by which the hand is moving the stone. This is what we call an essentially ordered series, because unlike with the fathers and the sons, in this case, the later members of the series have no independent powers of motion of their own. A son has an independent power to beget a son, but a stone has no independent power of motion. A stick has no independent power of motion. So although a son can beget a son even though the first father is gone, a stone cannot move without that hand pushing it, or pushing it through the instrument of a stick. So their ability to move and to move other things derives from the first member of the series. In an essentially ordered series, the series couldn't continue without these earlier members, the stick, and particularly the first member, the hand. Now, an accidentally ordered series does not need to have a beginning, but an essentially ordered series does. Now, I'm not going to go into why an accidentally ordered series doesn't have to have a beginning, but we can see that an essentially ordered series, like a stone being moved by a stick, being pushed by a hand, that does have to have a beginning. Now, an essentially ordered series, again, is not concerned with things going back in time. It involves a sequence occurring in the present moment, a stone being moved right now, by a stick being pushed right now, by a hand pushing right now. So each member depends simultaneously upon another, which depends simultaneously upon still another. We're not talking about a temporal sequence of events. We're talking about one change that's going on simultaneously with a series of members. If the last member of the series exists, the movement of the stone, then a first member must exist. The stone moves because the stick moves, and the stick moves because the hand moves. The stone's potentiality for movement is actualized by the stick, and the stick's potentiality for movement is actualized by the hand. But when we think about it, even the hand is not really the first member. The hand moves because the arm moves. The arm moves because the right muscles flex. The muscles flex because certain neurons fire, and that in turn depends on the firing of other neurons, which depends on the state of the nervous system, which depends on its current molecular structure, which depends on electromagnetism, gravitation, etc. So the hand does not have an independent power of motion either. So, suppose I cut my hand off. I chop my hand off, and my dead hand does not have any independent power of motion. So if I were to say, I have a couple things I want to do at once. I want to keep this stick moving this stone. So I'll chop off my hand, and I'll leave my hand pushing the stick that pushes the stone while I go eat a sandwich with my other hand. Well, of course, that's not going to work. So the actualization of one potential depends on the simultaneous actualization of another potential, which depends on the simultaneous actualization of another potential, and so on. Without a first member, there would be no series, because it is only the first member that is really doing anything, strictly speaking. The later members are just instruments of the first member. Take, for another example, a caboose. You see a caboose moving. What's pulling the caboose? Well, you see a freight car pulling it. But a freight car can't be the explanation. A freight car does not have an independent power of motion. So even if you had an infinite number of freight cars, that would still not explain the movement of the caboose. You have to have an engine car. Or likewise, a paintbrush painting a fence. What's making that paintbrush paint that fence? The brush handle? Even if the brush handle were infinitely long, brush handles have no independent powers of movement. There must be a first mover. So there must be a first mover at the beginning of any essentially ordered causal series in order for that series to exist at all. Now, what do we know, without a doubt, about the first mover in these series? We know that if an alleged first mover is itself moving or changing, it can't be the first mover. The first mover has to be itself unmoved, or to use the more modern vernacular, unchanging. Now, why is that? Well, because remember, nothing can actualize its own potentiality. Potentialities are actualized by another. Well, if something is moving or changing, then its potentiality is being actualized. But if its potentiality is being actualized, some other thing must be actualizing that potentiality, must be acting upon it to actualize that potentiality. So then this other thing must be the first mover. But if it itself is moving or changing, then its own potentiality, one of its own potentialities, is being actualized by still another. Well, this can't go on forever, or there would be no essentially ordered causal series. So therefore, the first mover in such a series must itself be unmoved or be unchanging, so that there is no infinite regress. And now we see, of course, Aquinas is not saying everything has a cause. He's saying that changes have causes, that the movement from potentiality to actuality has a cause. Yes, but not absolutely everything. The first mover does not change, does not have potentiality to actualize, because otherwise it couldn't be the first mover. We would still lack a full explanation for what's going on in an essentially ordered causal series. So the only way to stop the regress and arrive at a first member is with a being that, unlike all the other members of the series, does not have to be actualized by anything else. So this being must be pure actuality, or pure act, with no potentiality whatever. And with no potentiality or no potency to realize, this being could not move or change, because any movement, any change is itself a movement from potency to act. But this being is pure act. So it has no unrealized potentiality, no unactualized potentiality to actualize. So it can't move or change. And this, says Aquinas, is God. God is what makes change possible here and now. He is the final terminating point of every essentially ordered causal series. The logic of the matter demands it. Now, Aquinas, you can even go a lot farther than this and say that it's not just that God makes change possible, God actually keeps the universe in existence at every moment. Now, that's a much more complicated argument, but the point is there's an even stronger claim to be made than the one that I've made here. Now, right away, we can automatically dismiss the flying spaghetti monster. Immediately dismiss the flying spaghetti monster. Why? Well, let's just take the first word. I'll get to spaghetti later. But let's take the first word, flying. Flying involves the reduction of potency to act. A flying spaghetti monster that flies was actually here and potentially over there. But now that he goes over there, he's actually over there. His potential to be over there has now been actualized. So that means you're dealing with a being that had potentiality to be actualized. This being is not pure act and therefore can't remotely qualify to be God according to the Thomistic framework. So I've now dismissed the flying spaghetti monster in, what was that, 15 seconds? 20 seconds? Don't say that anymore. You just look ridiculous. Okay, if you have an argument to make sure it's an informed one. Or think about these arguments. Be honest enough to look at what the other side of the argument is saying. Now, we'll get in a minute to why a spaghetti monster, why spaghetti also rules it out. Now, I know it seems like, why are you taking this so seriously? Well, because people really, I find, think they've really got us with this snarky little response, but it's just so bad. It's so bad of an argument that it needs to be stomped on repeatedly. Okay, so now let's see, how does Aquinas then derive the divine attributes? He'll say, I've shown that God is pure act, that there must be something that is pure act, that has no unactualized potentiality. I have to now show how this helps us understand the nature of God. So from the first way, Aquinas concludes two important things: the existence of God, and God is pure act. Now he derives the following attributes, because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, why should you choose this God over that one? Why aren't you still worshiping Zeus or the ancient, the gods of ancient Greece or this or that? Well, Aquinas will give you an answer. And he'll say, for one thing, God has to be one. Monotheism must be true, Aquinas says, on the basis of this demonstration. So for every snarky person who says, well, I'm going to bring back the worship of Zeus and Apollo or whatever, he's going to dismiss this again in a 2-minute argument. But it's one that follows logically from God as pure act. He says, let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that there were more than one God. Well, if there's more than one of anything, There has to be some way in principle of distinguishing them. Right? I mean, think of anything you know. Think of two objects that you know. Compare them to each other. How can you compare them? How can you distinguish them from each other? One of them might be taller than another. One of them might be stronger or more powerful than another. There are all kinds of ways things can be different. But to distinguish two things, one of them must have at least one attribute that the other one doesn't have, right? So if you could have two things that are absolutely identical except one's taller than the other. Well, that's how you distinguish them. This one is this one and that one is that one. But what does it mean to lack a feature? To lack this degree of height? Lacking a feature is just an unrealized potentiality. Or you know what? Let's make it as difficult on ourselves as possible. Let's imagine two identical twins. And unless you know these identical twins very, very well, you really can't distinguish between them at all. And let's suppose they even had the same name. All right? But they are still two distinct beings. So how could you distinguish them? Well, you could distinguish them by the physical standing room they occupy. You could say, well, this one is on the left and that one is on the right. There's always something you use to distinguish between two things, even if they're pretty much identical in every way. Well, here's the problem. If you lack a feature, if I lack power, let's say, if there's another human being who's stronger than I am, that means I have an unactualized potentiality. I have not fully actualized my potential to be strong. Or if there's a dish with a cold egg on it and a dish with a hot egg, well, then the dish with the cold egg has not fully actualized its potentiality to be hot. But when we're dealing with God, we're dealing with a being that has no unactualized potentiality. So even when you have two identical twins standing next to each other, one of them's on the left and one of them's on the right. And the one who's on the right has not fully actualized his potential or her potential to be on the left. But God has no unactualized potentialities. And yet unactualized potentialities are the only way in principle we can distinguish between two things. So therefore, there is no way in principle to distinguish two gods. So therefore, there cannot be two gods. Monotheism follows directly from God as pure act. Likewise, God is immaterial because he's pure act, because being a material thing involves changeability. And remember, a purely actual being cannot be changeable, cannot have unactualized potentialities, where he can move from being one way to being another way and change. A purely actual, pure act, if you're pure act, you can't change. Change involves moving from potency to act, and you have no potency. Well, think of, to help understand this part of the argument, think of any material thing you're familiar with. It could be the human body, obviously changes. But even just think about something like a desk, and even apart from natural decay, you can chop up a desk and rearrange it if you wanted to. You could make a work of modern art out of it. You could chop it up and rearrange those parts. It's changeable by definition. And God can't be changeable because changeability involves moving from being potentially something to actually. So God can't be material, so he can't be a spaghetti monster. So we rule that out. Likewise, God would have to be outside of time and space. Being inside time and space likewise entails changeability. Now, Aristotle thinks about time as existing only where you have change. Time is the measure of change. But God can't change. He's utterly outside that whole framework of changeability. Now, if that's too abstract for you, think of it this way. When you move through time, you are moving from potentiality to actuality. If it's 3:30 in the afternoon, and then it becomes 3:31 in the afternoon, you have now actualized your potential to be in existence at 3:31 in the afternoon. Whereas before, at 3:30 in the afternoon, you had not fully actualized your potential to be at 3:31. So you moved, as you go through time, you're moving from potency to act. God has no potency to actualize. He has no unactualized potentiality, so God's outside time. God is all-powerful. This likewise follows from God as pure act. How does it follow? Well, we make reference to another Aristotelian principle. A cause cannot give what it does not have. So the cause of a feature must possess that feature either formally or eminently. Formally in the case of a lighted torch that sets a stack of papers on fire. That lighted torch, it basically is fire with a handle. It's not really a torch when it's blown out. Okay, so that is fire, and that fire is then imparted to the papers. But eminently in the case of a cigarette lighter, which is not itself on fire all the time. It's not necessarily on fire, but it has the ability to produce fire and thereby can convey fire. Well, if the unmoved mover, the first mover, is the source of all change, as Aquinas has demonstrated, if he is the source of things coming to have the attributes they have, from going from potentially some way to being actually that way, then God himself would have to possess all these attributes himself, because a cause cannot give what it does not have. And if God actualizes all these potentialities to be certain ways, God would also have to have those certain ways. He would have to have those powers himself, and that means God would have to be all-powerful. God would have to possess an intellect and a will for the same reason, because if human beings have intellects and wills, God must possess these attributes as well. Since he is the cause of them coming to have these things, a cause can't bestow something it does not have itself. Now finally, God is perfect and all good. Now what about the claim that, well, if God has all features perfectly, then wouldn't he have all negative features perfectly too? Wouldn't he be perfectly blind, perfectly stupid? But the answer here is that these are actually privations. These are not positive features in their own right. Blindness is simply a lack of sight. Stupidity is simply a lack of knowledge. So these things are privations. They're not positive features. Well, if God possesses every perfection and is therefore perfect and all good, how do we show this through knowing that he's pure act? And the answer is that having a perfection involves actualizing a potentiality. Well, the unmoved mover, from which all such features derive, is purely actual and has no unactualized potentiality. So therefore, he must enjoy all these attributes absolutely perfectly. Otherwise, there would be a potential that's unactualized, but there is no unactualized potential in a being that is pure act. So that is at least an introductory overview of one of the ways that Western theism has approached the idea of understanding God and demonstrating the existence of God and figuring out what his attributes must be. Whew. Okay, well, that took a lot out of me to go through that. I hope you found that helpful and interesting. I hope you find the whole show helpful and interesting. I'll refer you to a couple of sources in just a minute, but if you like the show, make sure you subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. I produce a new program Monday through Friday, commute-size program to bring you up to speed on all sorts of issues related to liberty. And if you really like the show and appreciate what I'm doing, then consider joining the elite as a supporting listener and get all kinds of goodies in the Tom Woods bag of goodies at supportinglisteners.com. Tomorrow we return to more mundane topics as Tom DiLorenzo joins us to talk about antitrust. All right, great stuff that. And if you want more on what I just said, you want a couple of reading sources, I will put a couple of links up, and I'll keep on adding things as they occur to me. If you want to head over to tomwoods.com/mover, and you'll find stuff there. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. Remember my new book, just off the presses, Real Dissent, A Libertarian Sets Fire to the Index Card of Allowable Opinion. You can get that at realdissent.com in a very inexpensive Kindle edition, also the paperback, and you can get a free audiobook edition at tomwoodsaudio.com with me reading it. See you tomorrow, everybody. Thanks for listening.
The Tom Woods Show.